Hi and welcome. My name is Abigail Opia, editor of EdgeIR, and joining me is Andrew Lindsey from Flexnode. Would you like to, first of all, give a brief introduction about yourself, and then we could take it from there?
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm Andrew Lindsey, co-founder and CEO of Flexnode. My background is sort of a little bit on the technology side and a little bit on the construction and engineering side. Before Flexnode, I was overseeing applied research and development for a company called Alpha Corporation that focused on highly complex mission critical projects as well as heavy infrastructure programs. And then before that, I had started a couple companies of my own, one on the hardware side for large scale events and concerts, and then the other on software.
Nice. And I think what's best for us to start with is the recent funding round. Tell me some of the key highlights of that funding round, how it went about, what are some of the stuff that the money will go towards essentially, or what the company's planning to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the funding round was actually spread across two parts of the seed raise. It was, yeah, an initial part that wrapped up around roughly May of 2023, and then another second part that wrapped up in January. So that's where that total capital in came from. As far as highlights, I would say one of the biggest highlights is that almost all of our capital came from strategic partners, largely oriented in the built environment. So as a big part of creating the foundation for making this successful at scale, we wanted to make sure that we brought in the best and greatest globally in the built environment, and that includes groups like Arup Engineering out of the UK, groups like Thornton Tomasetti Structural Engineering out of New York, Shop Architects out of New York that focus on industrial design. Groups like that not only worked directly with us for years, but also then financially invested in us. So I'd say that's the first part. The second part is what we're doing with it. So, the first part of that capital was to build out our first fully integrated Flexnode system, as is being showed actually or shown on Monday of next week at an open house that we're doing. The first system is a 12 rack configuration focused on a high performance liquid delivery, where today there is an isotope immersion system deployed inside, and there will be two other liquid cooled systems deployed inside as well. So that's an active large language model system that's running, actually technically 8 of them. And so this was the funding for that. We're getting this up and running, making sure everything tests and operates as we expect it to, narrowing in our parameters for our management and operation systems, things like that. On top of that, what we've done is we've developed out an end-to-end digital platform that starts at the earliest configurations from the customer's perspective and continues through the entire engineering, construction and manufacturing, delivery and operations and maintenance process, as well as training for service people that may be going into the facility without a full knowledge of what's inside or having ever been there before. And I may actually have this here. I do. We use solutions like this to accomplish it. As an example, we work with Magic Leap, and this allows for you to walk through in full scale photorealism what your data center will exactly be like and how it will operate. So that was part of that capital. Additionally, we expanded our team. We're roughly 16 full time, and altogether there's about 30 of us. And I will say this group is what we are most proud of. My co-founder, Bob Mazer, and I, we love our team. They are absolute, just amazing. Everything, we've seen them do and they continue to do has been extraordinary. And so we're continuing to grow out. And that ranges everything from engineering, supply chain, construction, manufacturing, virtual design, virtual operations, you name it. So there's a really great group there. And then finally, it's been expanding our ecosystem partnerships across the board. That ranges from real estate companies to infrastructure groups like power, water, and fiber, That's our service partners, like our engineers, contractors, and manufacturers. And then finally, our solutions providers. So, everyone from, the chip makers to the OEMs and the solutions they're doing. So a little bit of a fire hose, but we've done a bit with the capital.
Nice. You've kind of answered my next question in one, which is quite cool. And also, that device looks really cool. I'd love to have a try one day. But you spoke about liquid cooling, which I thought was, quite important because I've recently been covering a lot of news in that space, especially with isotope. Tell me how, in your opinion, liquid cooling is going to change the game. We've got other things that are coming to play. With AI, generative AI, edge AI, you name it, it's there. But with liquid cooling specifically, it seems as though it's one of those untapped markets that where like I guess the industry is fighting to all get inside. So tell me your thoughts on that, on what's going on.
Yeah, so I'd say that there's a number of opportunities and impacts that liquid cooling have that range from the solutions and applications that are being developed, but also from the built environment perspective and being able to actually safely support these liquid cooling solutions. So I'll start off with the latter, and then I'll go to the former. So where Flexnode really originally came from was seeing liquid cooling in, ready-made commercialized form in Barcelona now, I guess 6 years ago. And seeing the fact that this was going to be a direct connection between the IT solution and the building infrastructure. And so, as I sort of joke, but very seriously, this now makes the asset manager for the building care about everything all the way to the rack, because that asset manager now sees that rack as part of the broader cooling infrastructure for the building. And the IT manager now sees the broader building cooling infrastructure as part of their rack solution. And so there's a bridge that's being formed that has been a divide before between the building and what's operating at the rack level. That is, I think, embracing an opportunity for us to be right-sizing our deployments much more effectively rather than trying to do a one-size-fits-all solution. Because with this, whole set of high-density solutions that are the target for liquid cooling in many ways, it's just such a fundamentally different kind of build. So, that's on the one side. Is I think what we're going to see is a diversification of the types of data centers that are being built and deployed, where we will certainly still see the giant campuses and facilities that way, but also I think incrementally down to the singular megawatt facilities that are precision tuned for one application or another. So that's on one side. The other side is I think that we're going to see a huge rise in densities going forward. We just saw NVIDIA's liquid cooling announcement when, we had heard previously, not even more than about 9 months ago, that they were straying away from liquid cooling for several reasons. And so, to hear that now they're coming out with their, I guess it's their B100 1,000 kilowatt, 1,000 watt, 1 kilowatt chip. It's introducing an entirely new thinking around what can be done in these form factors. And so now I think that applications are going to be calling for those kinds of performances, and it'll be a feedback loop. So, we've heard from several large scale groups that there's an interest to deploy 2, 3, 4, 500 kilowatts in a singular rack within the next 5 years. And this is what we mean by just, it's going to keep doing that.
Very interesting. And going back to, some of the strategic partnerships that you mentioned before, how did these alliances kind of align with the company's long-term goals?
Absolutely. So, I think one key one to highlight is Arup Engineering, because, we've worked very closely with them over the last 2-3 years in developing this out. And a large part of that is that they are a true bleeding edge thinker in the built environment. So, when it comes to integrating the latest sustainability methods and practices, when it comes to being able to, solve certain problems in specific contexts, from an engineering perspective, they are absolutely second to none. And they're also 15,000 engineers that are global. And so what that gives us is a capability to have a global perspective and go into markets that we may be completely unfamiliar, but they may have somebody on the ground that has been there for the last 2 decades. And so it allows for us to build this sort of library of references on this global deployment, where we are certainly focused on going global within the next couple of years. So that's the one side. I'd say the other, on the investor side and partner side, is with shop architects. So shop architects before us, they spun out a company called Assembly OSM, which is also focused on the specific design methodology we use, design for manufacturing and assembly, or DFMA. And the focus is that we have configurable buildings that are adaptable on day 2 and are designed to go virtually anywhere. So I don't think I've shown this just yet, but I want to make sure I have a visual reference. Oh, right. I guess I can't show anything right now. But I can show you some visual references later.
Oh, thank you. Don't worry. I think we'll be able to probably share at some point somewhere else or within
Cool,
the,
cool, cool.
the context of this interview. But yeah, I guess so moving on in that case then, in what way does Flexnode's approach to data infrastructure differ from the traditional models, and how does this contribute to, your overall competitive advantage?
Yeah, so where our focus really is centered is being able to right size those deployments for what customers really need, rather than trying to shoehorn a customer into something that they may not. And so, what that really means from our perspective is working together with every layer of the stack, be it the data center companies on the real estate side, up to the managed service providers and the cloud service providers that are, facilitating what they're doing to their customers inside the 4 walls of a data center, or finally those enterprise users that have highly specified solutions that can't be necessarily met in a co-location facility that they're currently in, or in their current facility where they may be. So what we see is an opportunity now to enable customers to deploy buildings like computers. We see that, the NVIDIA quote from Jensen around, the data center is the new unit of compute. We totally agree. And we see that designing and building the data center to support what is going inside is going to be key, and making sure that it's adaptable is also going to be key. So ultimately, we see that the opportunity really is empowering these groups at any level of the stack to be able to have full control over what their building infrastructure is, and for the highest level of the stack, what the performance of their solution is and how that impacts their building infrastructure. I don't know
How
if that
easy?
answered
No,
answered.
it does. I was gonna say, how easy would does it? Because you've described it, and it sounds like in theory it's very doable and very possible. But how easy or challenging is that gonna be to try and make sure that everything's in line for the production to keep up with the current trends that's going on at the moment?
No, it's a really great question. So it is why we've spent the last 4 or 5 years in stealth, was building up that entire manufacturing capability, as well as that supply chain capability and the ecosystem partners that could manage, accelerate, and monitor all of those. So, while I will say it's certainly not going to be easy, there's definitely going to be a learning curve. It is exactly what we're built for. We didn't come at this with a general purpose data center to do, this, that, or the other. We came at this actually as a data center building process, and then worked to the product.
Nice. I'm also interested in some of the trends that you've got your eye on, other than the obvious ones. And are there any ones in the edge space? Because edge has evolved, I guess, since longer than I've been in the industry, and I've only been in the industry for like 5 years. So I'd like to hear from you. What trends are you looking at specifically, and also how the edge has evolved, and what trends in the edge space specifically are you looking at?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So, so the first I would say is sustainability. And why we see sustainability as being such a key factor is because that is where we started. It's also a large part of why we worked so closely with Arup was they are the sustainability leaders from an engineering perspective globally in the built environment. Why sustainability is such a focus is because the big question that I had early on, Bob and I had early on, was how do we meet the scope emissions goals, the scope reporting goals that have been laid out for us and now are being mandated by regulated policy, especially in Europe. And there's the first part, the scope 1 emissions, where we have a pretty significant control over that, right? Understanding how our data center is operating, how efficient that is. That's something that I think we're refining, but it is certainly in place as far as a generalized measure go, and it can be metered as such. The next is of course increasingly difficult, but we're certainly getting there, which is where your power is coming from, and the emissions that are happening as a result of where that power is being generated and how it's being transported. That is now coming into greater view for the built environment to be able to manage and report around that closely, and I think the data center industry is doing a good job of getting ahead of that. But there's this lingering last one that a lot of people are leaving off to the side, which is the scope 3 emissions, those embodied carbon emissions that the built environment as a whole is struggling with. And the challenge there is that when you get into things like embodied carbon for materials and embodied carbon for moving those materials to other materials manufacturers, to compound materials, and so on and so forth, these are groups that have never touched in many ways a reporting tool for sustainability goals, and in certain groups have never even heard of it. And so now demanding of them that they report in a specific way or they use a specific tool, it's a non-starter for a lot of these groups. And so why we focused on this design for manufacturing and assembly is because that gives us full visibility, not only in our tier 1 and tier 2 with our digital twin, or sorry, scope 1 and scope 2 with our digital twin, but also our scope 3 and where all of that infrastructure is coming from down to the materials. Where we are going with that is we do plan on being able to prioritize groups that effectively report, and then finally prioritizing groups that are able to maximize their efficiency to a specific standard that we need to meet and need to stand by. So that's the first small bit. The second part is AI inference. We're certainly super curious about where this is going. Based off of the most recent NVIDIA investor announcements, we see that it's certainly there and people are buying for these specific reasons. But we're wondering how this is going to impact this distributed infrastructure model where we know that inference is going to have a latency sensitivity. In certain cases, it's going to have a security sensitivity, a compliance and governance sensitivity, and in certain cases, even sustainability. So we're wondering how that then can be directed to specific layers of that stack, and we'll be keeping our sort of ear to the ground on that. And then the last is what's happening with the larger data centers today and the rate of obsolescence. So, we don't necessarily see there being this drastic shift away from the 5 and 10 kilowatt rack. But at the same time, we are seeing customers that are trying to pair that 5 and 10 kilowatt rack with a 50 kilowatt rack right next to it. And these retrofits are becoming more and more difficult to reach, where now I think we're starting to see what other things can we do to standardize this, and we see that as deviating from it. So what we're curious to see is how this plays out, both for the data center companies that are wondering sort of what they do with the buildings that may be approaching a level of obsolescence. But the other is what we're curious to see is what's happening with the financial markets to try to get ahead of this. We've certainly seen large players in the market try to short, from a stocks perspective, short data center companies because they see this obsolescence coming forward. But at the same time, I see that there's an opportunity to avoid that obsolescence at some level, but it'll be a balancing act. So that's the third.
Do you think you can come up with a solution? I guess obviously it's not a one size fit all, but especially for the data center, the bigger kilowatt data centers, is there a solution that you could just throw out there that could possibly work in your opinion?
So part of why our system is fully disassemblable and it can arrive as a kit of parts, almost like Lego, is because the system, it has components that can get into and out of most buildings. And those components are also small enough to fit in the smallest possible freight elevator at code. And the reason for that is we also see the Flexnode as a universal adapter that can go inside of these buildings. And so when we see retrofits that are required to support the latest and greatest liquid cooling technologies, it's not going to be a $10-20 million retrofit project every 3 to 5 years. It's going to be a Flexnode from our perspective. And that allows you to have that flexibility where you're improving the, surrounding infrastructure, but, quickly adapting the things that need to be adapted without those cost-intensive improvements.
And apart from, the funding round and the stuff that we've spoken about earlier, what else is Flexnode's got up its sleeves in terms of a growth trajectory? So in the next 2 to 3 years, what's the plan?
So the biggest thing for us is that we are developing out a constellation of sites that give us access to gigawatt scale, and gigawatt scale within the next 5 years. So, our focus is not doing the large scale campuses, but taking a very distributed play across multiple real estate segments. Those real estate segments being commercial office buildings, legacy data centers, as well as distributed infrastructure sites that are more on, say, the power side, telco side, things like that, where it's standalone outdoor sites.
Nice. And my last question is, what question should I have asked you that I didn't?
I guess the only one that I'd say is why don't we have one liquid cooling solution that we've tried to answer with, or we've tried to land on. And I think the biggest thing for us is because we're finding that there is not one liquid cooling solution that is dominating them all. We know that direct to chip or cold plate, or however you want to, is certainly leading the race. But there are other challenges that cold plate doesn't necessarily solve that, other, say, immersion-based solutions can. And so this is still kind of the Wild West for the liquid cooling market, as I think you said earlier, or something similar to it. And so what we focus on is adaptability and configurability between those different liquid cooled systems, and making sure that if a customer has a preference, we don't say no.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. This was a great interview, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from Flexnode in the future.
Looking forward to staying in touch for sure.